it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage, no, not another geologist, because we've had enough of them. No, instead, we get an accountant and a lawyer. Oh, yes, everybody, it's what we've all been waiting for. And so our next speakers that we have to welcome to the stage are the fantastic Michael Barron and Tim Law, who are going to explain to us the complexities, but also the excitement with regards to building trust using beneficial ownership transparency. Over to you, Michael and Tim.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And just to clarify the moment, I don't have a legal background. I don't have a geology background either. I'm a former government relations manager, but at some point in the past, I saw the light. And I'm now independent consultant, along with Tim, based here in the UK. And what we're going to talk about today is what we see as a very important tool. You mentioned in the past that the series of conferences has covered toolkit. An important tool in that toolkit, we believe, is beneficial ownership transparency, or BOT, to add another acronym to the long list already for this afternoon. And that is, who really owns companies, and an important element in building trust and understanding, and building trust and integrity in supply chains. And we're going to look about how you companies can use beneficial ownership, but also go one stage beyond that, and how you can maybe be a bit more proactive and actually add value with beneficial ownership transparency. So to move on, who do you trust in your supply chain? Who do you really trust? On the screen, as you can see, a number of well-known individuals who are the ultimate beneficial owners of companies. And this is what, we're not just talking about these gentlemen or others, rather well-known profiles. We're talking about the real people who own or ultimately control companies. And that's often, as the graphic on the right of the screen shows, through, well, in some cases can be quite simple structures, but may also be more complex and use legal instruments like trusts, or companies in so-called offshore jurisdictions, sometimes known as tax havens, to hide who really owns and controls the company. And beneficial ownership transparency is about looking through those structures and putting into the public domain details of who really owns the company, so you can see who you're really doing business with. And we'll come on to some of the implications of that in a minute. So how do you find out who really owns companies? What sources of information can you use? And as we speak at the moment, there is more and more information coming into the public domain. And there's a real international drive to create more transparency around beneficial ownership of companies and other legal entities and arrangements like trusts. So in some ways, the UK led the way. In April 2016, it started operations of the world's first public beneficial ownership register. Here in the UK, it's known as the Register of Persons of Significant Control, for some various legal reasons, which I won't go into. But on that register, which you can search by name of person or name of company, or the company number, registration number, if you know it, you get a certain amount of basic information on who really owns the company. And this is just an example of actually a Kazakh company, an individual, and what information is available on them, the address, how they own the company, what share of the company they own, and so forth. And the UK is not alone. Across Europe, about half the member states of the EU have some form of public register. In theory, every EU member state is supposed to have a public register, but that hasn't quite happened yet. And there is a huge debate going on in the EU on how to balance the right of privacy and making some of this information publicly available. And also, as I say, around the world, other countries are tackling this issue. Countries as diverse as Ukraine, Ghana, Indonesia, all have Armenia, all have some kind of public register, and others are following suit. And indeed, many countries have closed beneficial ownership registers. That is, they record the beneficial ownership of companies registered in their jurisdiction, but only make available to governments and law enforcement agencies. So there are resources beyond just the internet and expensive third-party due diligence providers to find out who the real owners of a company are. And the reason why this is, well, one of the reasons why this is important is that beneficial ownership information can be really, really useful to companies, not just in the mining sector, not just extracting, processing, or using raw materials, but across the economy. Really useful to you, either as a customer or a supplier, to understand who is in your supply chain. You may know the specific company that's supplying you gadgets, widgets, services, raw materials very well, but how well do you know their parent company? That may sit behind a very complex ownership structure, and somewhere in the chain there may be individuals who raise red flags, prominent politicians, and therefore you get into the realms of corruption, conflicts of interest, and so forth. Excuse me. Or individuals, or indeed companies, on international sanctions lists, and doing business with these types of people can bring real risks to your reputation, to your business, and indeed to the security of your supply chain. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Tim, who will take you through the next part of our short presentation.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And further to Sarah's introduction, I am an accountant, which sounds a little bit like an intro to self-help group. And maybe there is one that exists for accountants. And I should just say, if you hear any background noise, I am currently in the middle of a thunderstorm. So the noise is not added for dramatic effect or to build tension. It is real thunder in the background if you hear it. So what sort of information about beneficial owners should people be looking at, and what is available in those resources that Michael talked about? Well, in general, the information which you'd be looking at is the name of those individuals, the name of the beneficial owners, and there may be more than one. So companies can have multiple beneficial owners. Normally you would be able to find the partial date of birth. Full dates of birth don't tend to be disclosed because that creates a risk of identity theft and other criminal activity. You'll be interested in when that person became beneficial owner, because you may be looking at transactions that you've already undertaken with that company, and you may want to know whether that person was involved when you undertook a particular transaction. You may be interested in the nationality of the individual and their percentage ownership. Now, their percentage ownership is obviously relevant because that gives you some understanding as to whether or not they have a significant influence over that company, or whether maybe if it's a very small interest that they have, it may be that it is just part of their investment portfolio. You'd want to understand the nature of that ownership. So does this individual hold this directly? Are they actually just a shareholder in the company that you're doing business with? Or do they hold it through a long chain of ownership, which might in itself raise a red flag if that chain of ownership goes through lots of interesting jurisdictions? And the final one on a day of acronyms is PEP status. PEP is politically exposed person. So is the person who is the beneficial owner in a position of political influence, either in the country where the company is that you're looking to do business with, or possibly somewhere else in the world? Are they a minister, or possibly a former minister, or have they had a significant role in an international institution, which might mean that their involvement in a company, particularly if their role in government, say, was in the same sector as that business is now operating, does that potentially raise questions as to whether there may be some sort of greater risk of corruption or illicit enrichment or something else along those lines. So what sort of actions can you actually take as businesses? I mean, we've talked so far about you as a business using beneficial ownership information to understand about your suppliers and customers. But first of all, let's think about you being that company in the middle of Michael's diagram. So your suppliers and your customers are looking at you, and they are asking those same questions, and they are assessing the risk in their value chain and whether or not they want to do business with you. So what is it that you can do to make yourself more attractive and a lower risk partner to do business with? Well, one of the first things that you can do is you can publish your beneficial ownership information proactively. And you can do that in a way that makes it easy to access for those who are looking to do business with you. Perhaps put it on your website, or put it where a potential partner would look to find information about who you are and what you do. You could also provide that information unsolicited when you're bidding for work or clients. So even if a tender process, and lots of tender processes now do ask for beneficial ownership information, but also lots don't. If it doesn't ask for beneficial ownership information, still provide it. So differentiate yourself as a business as being a lower risk partner to do business with, because you are proactively providing this information that shows who you are and who owns the business and controls the business, when maybe some competitors may not choose to do that. You might incorporate beneficial ownership information to your policies or relevant public statements that you make about the way that you do business, in order to demonstrate that you really are open and a responsible business to engage with. But flipping back to Michael's diagram, the other thing to be doing is to be demanding beneficial ownership information from those you do business with. So making it part of your customer and supplier due diligence processes, so that you understand who the beneficial owners are, and you can assess that as part of your risk assessment of doing business with someone. And you can then identify whether there's anything you can do to mitigate any risks that might come up as a result of that beneficial ownership information, such as understanding whether or not a potential conflict of interest actually does exist, or whether there's anything in place to mitigate that potential conflict of interest. Finally, you can advocate for public beneficial ownership registers. Given that what we've said and shown is that there is a clear business use case for beneficial ownership information, and that information is not currently readily available everywhere in the world, there is a real benefit to businesses engaging in that debate and demonstrating that they use beneficial ownership information and the value of it, because all too frequently governments perceive that businesses are opposed to this sort of transparency because it's a compliance burden and it's another thing for businesses to worry about. The more that we can demonstrate that actually businesses really find this information useful as part of managing risk and as part of understanding the challenges that there are in mineral supply chains, particularly, looking forward to the challenges around critical minerals, the more we can do that, the more governments will understand that it's something that really they should be embracing and should be doing. So that concludes our presentation, and I'll hand back to Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tim, and to Michael as well. Massive round of applause to both of you. Thank you so much for giving us that insight into what is meant by this thing called beneficial ownership, because I think it's something that a lot of us have heard of, but don't necessarily know what it is, nor actually, and I say this emotively, how easy it is to make sure that you do know who you're doing business with in certain parts of the world. Is that fair to say, Tim, or have I just simplified it massively?
No, I mean, I think, there are varying degrees of accessibility of information. So some companies, as Michael has said, some countries have registers that you can look at, some don't. Some have registers, but as a private individual, you can't access them. There are also a range of levels of quality of information that are in those registers. And that's partly because this is a fairly new topic, and countries are learning and are improving how they verify the information that's on the register. So, for example, the businesses in the financial and legal sector, so the lawyers and accountants, but banks as well, they have an obligation to do this. They have an obligation to find out who the beneficial owners are of every client that they take on before they take them on, and maintain that information throughout and beyond the end of their client relationship. They do that by a bilateral conversation with the client. So if you've ever created a business or taken out a business bank account or engaged an accountant or lawyer, you've probably had these questions about who the beneficial owner is of the company. At the moment, banks, lawyers and accountants are not allowed to solely rely on something like the UK's register of beneficial ownership. They have to first of all have that bilateral conversation with their clients. They can then use registers that are out there to test whether or not what they're being told seems to be correct. Are there discrepancies? Is there something that's on a register that raises a red flag? Now, that doesn't mean that as a business that's outside of that sector, those registers can't be a really valuable starting point. And what we see in the UK is there are hundreds of thousands of unique hits on the UK register every single month. And the biggest user group of that register is SMEs. SMEs doing high level due diligence to understand the market. So in that sense, yes, you're right, Sarah. There are opportunities around the world in some jurisdictions to do just that. There are other places where you need to kind of do the legwork yourself.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Tim.